The pre-dawn gloom of December 16, 1944, hung heavy and frostbitten over the snow-laden Ardennes forest, a stark canvas for Hitler's desperate gamble, Operation Wacht am Rhein. As the lead elements of the Wehrmacht's 5th Panzer Army surged westward, their initial breakthroughs were met with the predictable, if fierce, resistance of American defensive positions. But on this specific morning, near the obscure village of Mona, something profoundly unsettling, something that defied every combat veteran's experience, began to erupt from the sky. Typically, artillery fire announced its deadly arrival with the scream of incoming shells, followed by the concussive, earth-shattering impact or the deadly crack of a tree burst. But here, over the heads of the advancing German infantry and panzer grenadiers, shells began to detonate with an inexplicable, terrifying regularity, not on impact, but suspended in midair, showering lethal shrapnel downwards in an unseen, inescapable deluge. This was no ordinary barrage. German soldiers, hardened by years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front and across Western Europe, instinctively sought cover in foxholes and behind the modest protection of the terrain, only to find their usual sanctuaries rendered suddenly, horrifyingly inadequate. Confusion quickly morphed into a chilling dread. What unseen force was unleashing this rain of steel from above? There were no visible aircraft, no telltale signs of proximity fuses, a technology the Wehrmacht's intelligence services believed was either non-existent or far from deployment on the Western Front. This was a form of aerial devastation they had never encountered, an invisible scythe cutting through their ranks with chilling efficiency. For the German fighting man, the inferno over Mona on that fateful December morning was not merely a new tactic. It was the genesis of a protracted, psychological torment, a nightmare from the skies that signaled the arrival of a new, terrifying chapter in the technological brutality of warfare. The inferno over Mona was a stark preview. Yet, on December 16, 1944, as the first gray light of dawn broke over the snow-laden Ardennes forest, the overarching German strategic imperative was one of audacious desperation. This was Adolf Hitler's Wacht am Rhein, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, his last desperate gamble to reverse the tide of a war he was unequivocally losing. His strategic vision was simple yet impossibly ambitious. Launch a massive surprise offensive through the lightly defended, rugged terrain of the Ardennes, split the Anglo-American forces, seize the vital port of Antwerp, and thereby compel the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace, allowing him to concentrate his depleted resources against the Soviets in the East. Months of meticulous planning, executed with an almost fanatical secrecy, had enabled the assembly of 3 German armies, over 250,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft, directly opposite a thinly stretched American line. The weather, thick with fog and low clouds, played directly into German hands, effectively neutralizing Allied air superiority. The initial assault, spearheaded by armored divisions like the 1st SS Panzer, achieved near-total tactical surprise. American units, caught off guard in their winter quarters, often found themselves overrun or surrounded before they could mount an organized defense. The Panzers, despite their dwindling numbers, broke through the forward positions, creating a salient, the Bulge, that plunged deep into Allied territory. The swift, brutal advance rekindled a fleeting, dangerous confidence within the Wehrmacht ranks. For several critical days, the momentum was theirs. They believed, with a fervent, almost deluded hope, that victory, or at least a reprieve, was within their grasp. Unaware that a silent, invisible terror was about to descend, fundamentally altering the calculus of their desperate offensive. The chaos and terror experienced by German troops at Mona, witnessing artillery shells explode not on impact but mysteriously in midair, were the direct consequence of a radical innovation. This was not merely an improved detonator, it was a self-contained miniature radar system designed to fundamentally alter the destructive capability of artillery ordnance. At its core, the proximity fuse contained a tiny vacuum tube-based transmitter and receiver. As the artillery shell hurtled towards its target, the transmitter continuously emitted radio waves. These waves would bounce off the ground, trees, or any substantial object below and be reflected back to the fuse's receiver. The genius lay in its ability to detect the change in the frequency of these reflected waves, a principle known as the Doppler effect, as the shell approached the target. When the shell reached a pre-calibrated, optimal height above the ground, typically between 50 and 70 feet, the fuse automatically triggered the main explosive charge. For the German soldier, this was an invisible killer. There was no telltale impact crater to offer cover, no predictable trajectory to gauge. Shells simply materialized into deadly shrapnel clouds above their positions, raining down lethal fragments from an unexpected vector. This aerial burst created a massive, conical spray of high-velocity shrapnel and blast overpressure, covering a far wider area than a conventional ground-burst shell. Instead of burying itself in the soft earth, losing much of its destructive energy, the proximity-fused round maximized its kill radius. It transformed previously safe foxholes, trenches, and even the natural cover of the Ardennes dense forests into death traps. This seemingly minor adjustment in detonation point had a catastrophic effect on lethality. Studies and battlefield assessments quickly indicated that the proximity fuse could be up to 50 times more effective against personnel in the open or under light cover compared to a standard impact-fused shell. It was, in essence, a technological leap that rendered traditional defensive tactics obsolete against artillery fire, creating an omnipresent, invisible threat that defied conventional understanding. The invisible terror that haunted the Ardennes was not born of magic or infernal design, but from a clandestine scientific crucible. The genesis of the proximity fuse lay deep within the hollowed halls of the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, APL, where a brilliant physicist named Dr. Merle A. Tuve led a team of dedicated scientists and engineers. Their mission, initiated in August 1940, was nothing less than to revolutionize artillery warfare by making shells explode precisely where they would inflict maximum damage. The project, often referred to within the highest echelons as a secret rivaling the Manhattan Project, was shielded by an impenetrable veil of security. Its revolutionary nature and strategic implications demanded absolute secrecy, ensuring that the Axis powers remained utterly oblivious to its existence and potential. The challenge facing Tuve's team was monumental. They had to miniaturize a functional radar system, complete with its delicate vacuum tubes and intricate circuitry, to fit snugly within the nose cone of an artillery shell. This tiny electronic marvel then had to endure the unimaginable stresses of being fired from a cannon. Upon launch, the device was subjected to an acceleration of up to 20,000 times the force of gravity, alongside extreme rotational stresses as the shell spun through the air at thousands of revolutions per minute. Every component, particularly the fragile vacuum tubes, had to be engineered with unprecedented resilience, capable of withstanding such brutal forces while maintaining operational integrity. It was a feat of material science, electrical engineering, and sheer inventive brilliance, pushing the boundaries of what was then considered possible in applied physics. The initial shock for the German soldiers on the front lines was profound. They had endured countless artillery barrages, but this was undeniably different. Instead of the familiar thud of an impacting shell and the subsequent cratering explosion, these projectiles detonated with an eerie, almost supernatural precision, high above the tree canopy or just meters from the ground. This airburst capability, a direct consequence of the proximity fuse, rendered their entrenched positions and foxholes virtually useless. Standard defensive tactics, predicated on digging in to avoid direct impacts, offered little to no protection against a rain of steel fragments descending from above. The dense Ardennes forest, once a strategic advantage, offering concealment and cover, now became an amplification chamber of death. Each airburst transformed the wooded terrain into a maelstrom of flying shrapnel and deadly wood splinters. Trees, once perceived as robust shields, shattered into thousands of projectiles, adding another layer of terror to the aerial bombardment. For the German infantry, there was no safe direction. Every detonation created an indiscriminate 360-degree kill zone, sweeping through the undergrowth with devastating efficiency. The psychological impact was immense, as the very landscape they sought refuge in turned against them, making every patch of woods a potential tomb. The initial horrifying encounters in Mona were but a prelude. As the Battle of the Bulge intensified, the steel rain became a pervasive, devastating reality across the Ardennes front, turning pivotal engagements into nightmares for the Wehrmacht. The strategic decision by commanders like Colonel Axelson to deploy the Proximity Fuse, despite prior restrictions, quickly proved its tactical worth, albeit at a terrible cost to the German forces. Perhaps nowhere was this more evident than at Bastogne. Here, the valiant 101st Airborne Division, encircled and facing relentless assaults, found their desperate defense bolstered by an unseen technological edge. The German besiegers, relying on the cover of the dense woods and the resilience of their prepared positions, discovered their traditional tactics rendered obsolete. Artillery shells from the 463rd and 969th Field Artillery Battalions, now armed with the new fuse, detonated precisely above their foxholes and troop concentrations. This airburst effect, a cruel mockery of their attempts to dig in, transformed the defensive terrain into an open killing field. German infantry, stripped of their cover, suffered disproportionately, their morale crumbling under an incessant barrage that offered no respite. Further south, as General Patton's Third Army launched its audacious counteroffensive, the Proximity Fuse became a crucial enabler for breaking the German grip. The crossing of the icy Sauer River, a fiercely contested objective, saw the devastating application of this new technology. German defensive lines, meticulously established along the riverbanks and within the forested terrain beyond, were systematically pulverized. The corkscrew effect of the airbursts, showering shrapnel and wood splinters downwards, created a truly inescapable zone of destruction. The grim toll was evident in the aftermath, with reports indicating over 700 German bodies recovered from the Sauer River sector alone, a testament to the indiscriminate lethality of the fuse. These engagements, from the besieged perimeter of Bastogne to the blood-soaked banks of the Sauer, underscored the profound tactical shift. German units, already stretched thin and battered by the winter campaign, faced a form of artillery that negated their most basic defensive measures. The psychological impact was immense. The very act of seeking shelter now offered little protection, fostering a pervasive sense of vulnerability and despair that gnawed at the fighting spirit of the German soldier. The invisible steel rain was no longer just a localized phenomenon. It was a widespread, terrifying reality shaping the brutal climax of Hitler's last gamble. By December 1944, as the Konrad Hepp began to decimate their forces, the German High Command faced a profound intelligence vacuum regarding this new artillery threat. Despite numerous instances where intact proximity fuses were recovered from dud rounds, the German intelligence apparatus proved remarkably inept at identifying and comprehending this revolutionary technology. These captured components, sophisticated miniature radar systems, were often dismissed as impossible or unimportant by analysts steeped in conventional ballistics and electronics. This institutional blindness was exacerbated by the prevailing technological mindset and, critically, by directives emanating directly from the Führer. Adolf Hitler, often prone to dismissing Allied technological advancements as mere propaganda or inferior engineering, had issued orders that effectively stifled serious investigation into captured enemy equipment. His pronouncements created an environment where resources for reverse engineering or even thorough analysis of new Allied weapons were scarce, or worse, deemed unnecessary. Consequently, the critical intelligence that could have informed defensive strategies or spurred counter-development was either ignored or misinterpreted. This catastrophic failure meant German frontline troops were sent into the Ardennes completely unprepared for the invisible menace that awaited them. Their tactical doctrine, honed against conventional artillery, offered no effective counter to rounds detonating precisely above their foxholes and dugouts. The devastating psychological and physical toll inflicted by the proximity fuse was, in large part, a direct consequence of a strategic intelligence miscalculation that bordered on willful ignorance. As the festive season of Christmas 1944 descended upon the Western Front, it brought little comfort to the beleaguered Wehrmacht. For the German soldiers shivering in their foxholes and makeshift shelters across the frozen Ardennes, the traditional respite of the holidays was replaced by an unprecedented terror. This was not merely the biting cold or the conventional dangers of artillery fire. This was a new, insidious fear, one that hunted them relentlessly, day and night, transforming the very concept of sanctuary into a cruel illusion. The immediate tactical implication of the proximity fuse was its ability to nullify traditional defensive positions. Conventional artillery, even when accurate, typically required a direct hit or a close ground impact to be lethal against entrenched troops. However, the American VT fuse, detonating precisely above the target area, circumvented this defensive advantage entirely. It unleashed a wide, conical spray of lethal shrapnel downwards, effectively reaching into foxholes, slit trenches, and even lightly covered dugouts. This meant that the German soldier, no matter how deep he dug, how well he camouflaged, or how skillfully he utilized the terrain for cover, remained vulnerable. This continuous, unseen threat proved to be a profoundly effective form of psychological warfare. The established rhythm of battle, where periods of intense engagement were often interspersed with moments of relative quiet or the perceived safety of covered positions, was completely disrupted. With shells exploding overhead, seemingly at random, without the telltale impact crater that indicated a miss, there was no safe interval. Sleep became a luxury, constantly interrupted by the terrifying, air-bursting concussions and the knowledge that death could descend from an invisible point in the sky at any moment. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers could never truly rest, never feel secure, and the constant state of hypervigilance rapidly eroded their combat effectiveness and morale. The proximity fuse transformed the serene, snow-laden forests of the Ardennes into a veritable killing ground, turning what should have been a period of reflection and hope for the German troops into a relentless nightmare of attrition and fear. The devastating reach of the proximity fuse did not discriminate. Its indiscriminate lethality struck down not only the less experienced Volksgrenadier formations, but also the battle-hardened veterans of the Waffen-SS, units often considered the cutting edge of the Wehrmacht's offensive power. Even the infamous Kampfgruppe Piper, part of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte S. Adolf Hitler, a force renowned for its aggressive tactics and fanatical resolve, found their advances critically hampered by the invisible barrage. These were the very units that had orchestrated the initial brutal breakthroughs and whose actions had led to atrocities like the Malmedy massacre. Yet, their formidable combat prowess offered no immunity to the aerial explosions. Similarly, the highly specialized commandos of Otto Skorzeny's Operation Greif, units hand-picked for their audacity, cunning, and infiltration skills, faced the same insidious threat. Tasked with sowing chaos behind Allied lines, these elite saboteurs, often operating under deep cover and in small, agile teams, were still vulnerable to the broad, sweeping arcs of destruction wrought by proximity-fused artillery. Their superior training, psychological resilience, and mastery of irregular warfare, honed over years of brutal Eastern Front combat, offered little defense against projectiles detonating high above, showering them with lethal fragmentation irrespective of the available cover. The concept of seeking shelter in foxholes or behind natural terrain features was fundamentally undermined when the explosions occurred directly overhead, transforming forests into lethal shrapnel traps and open ground into zones of inescapable death. The proximity fuse thus proved to be a formidable equalizer, systematically eroding the psychological and tactical advantages of even Germany's most fanatical and capable fighting formations, demonstrating that no amount of elite training or ideological fervor could withstand the sheer technological superiority now unleashed upon them. The proximity fuse's devastating effectiveness was not confined to isolated engagements. It systematically altered the battlefield calculus across the entire Ardennes front. One of the most stark demonstrations occurred at Elsenborn Ridge, a critical defensive anchor held by American forces against relentless German assaults, primarily from the elite 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte S. Adolf Hitler and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. Despite facing determined and often fanatical attacks, the American artillery, increasingly equipped with the VT fuse, proved to be the decisive factor. Analysis from the conflict revealed a chilling statistic. While shells fitted with proximity fuses constituted only a quarter of the total artillery ammunition expended on the ridge, they were responsible for an astonishing 60% of all German casualties. This disproportionate impact underscored the fuse's ability to neutralize traditional infantry tactics, turning seemingly safe foxholes and dense forests into kill zones as shrapnel rained down from above, pre-detonated at optimal height. This technological dominance was not limited to ground combat. As Hitler's Ardennes offensive faltered, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte on New Year's Day 1945, a desperate last-gasp effort to regain air superiority by striking Allied airfields across Belgium, Holland, and France. While the surprise attacks initially caused significant damage to Allied aircraft on the ground, the German pilots then had to contend with the formidable anti-aircraft defenses guarding these vital installations. Crucially, a significant proportion of these Allied anti-aircraft batteries were by then also equipped with the proximity fuse. The results were catastrophic for the already depleted Luftwaffe. In a single day, Bodenplatte cost Germany 300 aircraft, with a staggering 172 of those losses directly attributable to Allied anti-aircraft fire, a substantial majority of which were brought down by shells armed with the VT fuse. This crippling blow decimated the Luftwaffe's remaining experienced pilots and aircraft, effectively ending its capacity for any meaningful offensive operations on the Western Front for the remainder of the war. The cork in the bottle of aerial defense had been firmly inserted, a testament to the fuse's versatility and unparalleled lethality, both on the ground and in the skies. In the sober light of post-war analysis, the true strategic impact of the proximity fuse became undeniably clear, even to those who had suffered its devastating effects. German high command, initially bewildered by this invisible scourge, offered stark and often chilling testimony once the full scope of its deployment and capabilities was revealed. Field Marshal Gert von Rundstedt, the venerable German Supreme Commander West, offered a stark assessment of the Allied technological advantage, stating that the new fuse had more than offset our numerical superiority in the Ardennes. He and other senior officers, interrogated after the conflict, unequivocally attributed tens of thousands of casualties to this single innovation. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army and one of Hitler's most capable commanders during the offensive, described the psychological and material toll with grim precision. He lamented the inability of his troops to find cover from the relentless aerial bursts, noting that the fuse rendered traditional field fortifications and even dense forests effectively useless against artillery. German intelligence had dismissed captured fuses as improbable or too complex for mass production, a critical failure that left their forces strategically blind to a weapon that was rapidly decimating their ranks. Their post-war testimonies highlighted how this technological disparity was not merely an inconvenience, but a fundamental shift in the tactical landscape, fundamentally contributing to the unraveling of Hitler's final gamble and ushering in an era where technological supremacy would increasingly dictate the outcome of large-scale ground offensives. While the proximity fuse undoubtedly showcased Allied technological supremacy and fundamentally altered the strategic landscape, its most profound and immediate impact was felt on the ground by the soldiers themselves. For the German Landwehr in the Ardennes, particularly the young, often undertrained conscripts of the Volksgrenadier divisions, the steel rain was not a strategic concept, but a terrifying, inescapable reality. Imagine the psychological torment: artillery shells that detonated not on impact but mid-air, showering fragmentation downward from an unseen source. Trenches offered little sanctuary, foxholes became death traps. The conventional wisdom of seeking cover from shell bursts was rendered obsolete, replaced by a pervasive, omnipresent threat that bred a profound sense of helplessness and dread. Veterans of earlier campaigns described it as fundamentally different, a new dimension of terror that decimated their ranks before they could even close with the enemy. Casualties mounted rapidly, not just from direct hits, but from the thousands of lethal steel fragments that scythed through the densely forested terrain, turning every tree into a potential shrapnel accelerator. The deployment of such a devastating weapon naturally raises complex ethical considerations. From the Allied perspective, the proximity fuse was a tool to shorten the war, to save the lives of their own troops, and to defeat a regime responsible for unimaginable atrocities. The very secrecy surrounding its development, akin to the Manhattan Project, underscored its perceived strategic value and the urgency of its mission. Yet, for the German soldiers on the receiving end, the shrapnel granate was indiscriminate, a merciless harbinger of death that felt inherently unfair, stripping away their ability to employ basic battlefield tactics for self-preservation. The proximity fuse fundamentally transformed the combat experience for the German Wehrmacht. It rendered traditional defensive positions far less effective, amplified the psychological pressure of sustained combat, and significantly diminished the concept of safe ground. For those who survived the Ardennes, the memory of the invisible steel rain would forever symbolize a new, terrifying chapter in warfare, one where technology, not just courage or numbers, increasingly held the ultimate sway, leaving an indelible mark on a generation of soldiers. The proximity fuse, a weapon forged in the crucible of desperation at Ardennes, had undeniably played a brutal and decisive role in blunting the Wehrmacht's final offensive. Yet, its true legacy extends far beyond the snowy forests of the Bulge. This seemingly simple device, packed with miniature radar technology and vacuum tubes capable of withstanding forces exceeding 20,000 Gs, was a foundational stone in the edifice of modern electronics. The colossal industrial effort required to produce these fuses, involving over 100 companies and $1 billion, perfected mass production techniques for complex electronic components, establishing supply chains and quality control standards that would become industry benchmarks. More profoundly, the proximity fuse introduced a paradigm shift, the idea of a munition that could think, however primitively. Its radar-based intelligence, detecting targets and detonating at optimal points, laid the crucial groundwork for the development of guided missiles, for smart bombs, and eventually for the sophisticated precision-guided munitions that define contemporary conflict. The invisible steel rain of Ardennes was not merely a tactical victory, it was a profound strategic statement. It heralded an era where scientific superiority, industrial innovation, and the mastery of advanced technology would become the definitive arbiters of battlefield success. The proximity fuse irrevocably transformed warfare, ushering in the technological age where intellectual capital and engineering prowess became as vital, if not more so, than sheer manpower or conventional firepower. The battlefields of the future, shaped by this tiny, intelligent device, would never be the same.